Welcome to the Living Word. We are going to hear from Bob Fowler about the NRSVue or NRSV. We were just talking about the seminary that I attended, which in that seminary there is a room where decades ago all the people got together to translate the NRSV itself.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
really?
I don't think that it rubbed off on me though. Smart man to work into that room. But now we're looking at the NRSV is New Revised Standard Version is certainly the version of choice of the Episcopal Church, or at least until now, because there's translation. And we're going to hear from Bob about the nature of that translation and why it even matters, right? We already have a pretty contemporary version of the Bible. Why do you need another translation? Well, it's a rhetorical question, but we're going to hear from Bob about that, and then we'll do some Q&A after that. All right. Bob, take us away.
Well, I need to throw in a footnote right away that Deborah mentioned the American Bible Society, and it's thanks to the American Bible Society that she and I are married. She was a staff member with the American Bible Society in a satellite operation in Springfield, Missouri. They were headquartered in New York City at the time on Broadway and 12th, near the Columbus Circle. Really a lovely, lovely location, prime real estate, and they sold the building years ago, moved to Philadelphia, and I've lost track of them. I'm not sure where they are now, headquartered, but she was a staff member in Springfield, Missouri, and I was one of the biblical scholar consultants that had been brought on board to help ABS produce some wonderful, wonderful, progressive, innovative products, music videos, not quite MTV style, but back, it was years and years ago, so it was fresh after the heyday of MTV. And CDs and DVDs, stuff was really way out in front for its time, and then sadly they abandoned it all, and she lost her job, so we got married and she moved to Ohio.
Actually, the married worked before I lost my job.
So we thank God for ABS bringing us together, and for a few wonderful outings in New York City back in the old days.
And we don't tell what we did before we got married.
No, of course not.
We both do.
Nice restaurant. The New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. I'm going to...
I didn't even catch that it was Updated Edition. I just thought Vue was a catchy title.
No, it's Updated Edition. So... and I think they want us to leave the U and the E in lowercase. I don't know why, but I'm sure it'll flip back and forth between all caps and 4 caps and 2 lowercase letters, but that's neither here nor there. But the full title is the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. And I'm looking at my notes here, which you all should have in front of you. It's buried. Okay, good. There's a chart that the American Bible Society produced actually many years ago on the history of the English Bible, and I'd like to spend quite a bit of time tonight on that and share a personal story about how I got interested in the history of the English Bible, and it happened after I had left grad school. I went to had 6 years of grad school studying Bible and never studied seriously the history of Bible translation. We were dealing with ancient stuff, ancient texts, with ancient understandings. That's what we focused on. We did not look at the 2,000-year history of Bible translation. Could have looked at it, but
It feels like that's a slightly more recent, in terms of the new. I think we pay closer attention to the nuances of how we're putting the punctuation in English, as opposed to before we relied heavily on scholars of old languages.
oh, you raised 3 or 4 issues right there. That this new translation concentrates heavily on punctuation, which bores me to death. So but the wording changes they've introduced are very interesting. I might well have studied the history of Bible translation if I'd wanted to take that on as a special focus of study, but it wasn't of interest to me, which is ironic given the personal story that I'm going to tell you about someone who did take that history very seriously, Edgar Goodspeed at the University of Chicago, 40 years before I was at the University of Chicago. So I could easily have fallen into the tradition of Edgar Goodspeed at Chicago, but didn't. So it's just happenstance, just accidental. So new NRSVue, this has been done by the National Council of Churches, which owns the copyright for the Revised Standard Version, and then the new RSV, Revised Standard Version 1940s, 1950s, and then the new Revised Standard Version 1989, and now they were one of the major players to produce the next iteration, the NRSVue. So National Council of Churches, this is partly their doing. Their major partner in this was the Society of Biblical Literature, which is the first time ever in the 100-plus, more like 130 or 140-year history of the Society of Biblical Literature. The first time they've been involved formally and officially as a body of biblical scholars, and been heavily involved together in a major translation effort. So the National Council of Churches, the Society of Biblical Literature, are the two organizations who did this work. And yes?
Who is that society?
The Society of Biblical Literature is clearly the major academic society for biblical scholars in North America, but in fact it has an international presence as well, so it's known and participated in by scholars all over the world.
It covers the Roman Church as well.
They would say they are not affiliated with any one particular religious tradition, and Jewish scholars are in there along with Protestant, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, you name it, everyone is invited to play. The point is scholarship rather than a particular theological perspective. And for what it's worth, I've been a member of the SBL for probably 50 years. So it is the organization for biblical scholars in the United States, and more it's international. We've never been to one of the international meetings, but she and I have been to many of the national meetings of the SBL. So those are the two bodies that made this translation. And this is built upon the new Revised Standard Version of 1989. So it's been 35 years since the previous major production. And so after 35 years, it's worth a look again. I think...
One question now.
Yes.
it reminds me of prayer book revision and the process of when you go through a change. Is it a wholesale back to basics?
No.
Is this a dig in brand new scholarship? Is this, before we get to this, first of all, I was wrong at my seminary. It was the RSV room. Right, so that was where that.
Okay.
I think.
Okay.
I have no idea where the NRSV actually got re-edited.
I don't know either.
But how significant was the transition from the RSV to the new RSV, the NRSV? Because just to give us a sense of what the platform is that we're entering into with the updated edition.
I can't give you an honest, informed answer because I've never engaged in serious study like that. But in your contribution to our little blurb, which has been going out for several weeks, you rightfully indicated that this is a revision rather than a wholesale new translation, and revision rather than wholesale new is what we've been doing for centuries and centuries and centuries. If you are in the lineage of the King James Bible, we probably should take a look at the chart here. I will not inflict the whole 2 or 3 week college classroom exploration of this upon you tonight, but this is 2200, 2300 centuries of Bible translation going all the way back to the Septuagint, 2 or 3 centuries BCE. So translation has forever and ever been going on, and it will never cease, I'm sure. And lots and lots and lots of influence from one source, one translation to another. So, but let's look at the King James Bible right in the middle there, King James Bible 1611. That was followed closely by the English Revised Version done by British scholars in the UK, late 1800s. And then there's an American version, really the same. And the main change between those two is simply Americanizing the English, using American spelling instead of British spelling. So otherwise, not big differences between those. And then the Revised Standard Version came about in the 40s and 50s, and then the new RSV in 1989. The date here is wrong. It's not 1990, it's 1989.
It's a rounding error.
And in each of those cases, it's really revision and not wholesale starting from scratch. But if you look down at the very, very, very bottom, there's a box at the bottom, Moffat, Smith, Goodspeed. That's my Goodspeed, Edgar Goodspeed. Modern Language, Jerusalem. See, the box there floats alone in space. Those are all from scratch translations. And that's more and more what lots and lots of people are doing. If you're dealing with the legacy, the family tree, if you will, of the King James, you'll go from King James to English Revised, American Standard, RSV, New RSV, and in each case, it's updating, it's revision, it's not wholesale brand new. And I'll say just a few words here in a minute or two about why we would even undertake that. There are good reasons to do it, and I could bore you to tears talking forever about some of the new manuscript discoveries. For example, when I was in grad school, we used to say that of Greek New Testament manuscripts only, not considering Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Ethiopic, just Greek, it was said there were 5,000 manuscripts. Now the number is closer to 6,000. And when you get new manuscripts, and sometimes with new wording, you begin to think, ooh, what if this needs to be taken seriously. So that alone brings about new insights, new understandings, and so on. So this new translation is an attempt to update, to improve, given. Let me get on to the reason why we need to do that. Back to my my general introductory handout here. I didn't mention the third little, or maybe I did in essence mention the third paragraph there. This whole family of RSV, new RSV, new RSVue, has widespread support from Protestants, Anglicans, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox. Jewish scholars have been involved in the production of all of these at least since the 1940s, and it might go back further than that. So in a great deal of the mainstream Christian English-speaking world, this family of translations is warmly embraced.
I may be completely messing up your flow, and stop me if this is something
ahead.
you're going to get to.
This is welcome. I welcome comments, questions at any point.
I don't always get told that. Thank you. Tell me a little bit about respect for Jewish tradition. That seems like a really important thing, both in terms of tone and translation. I mean, we're talking about something that is primarily for a Christian audience. I may be wrong on that. So,
That's
so
true.
That's true. That seems like a really important thing to be raising. And tell me why.
Well,
that's important.
I don't think the breadth of Jewish involvement was gigantic, but I do know for certain that Jewish scholars, at least one, I don't know how many, at least there was some Jewish representation in the original RSV translation work. So there was a Jewish contribution, and since an organization like the SBL is ecumenical, non-sectarian from the get-go, there was a great, if the SBL is involved, there will be a great deal of respect for the Jewish perspective. And a concrete example of how Jewish concerns, Jewish perspective has been recognized and honored, incorporated over a number of decades is the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s.
Oh, yes.
In the 1940s, I want to say 1947 or so, the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls was brought into Jerusalem and photographed by a fellow who was in a postdoctoral position there. And later he came to be a professor teaching religion at Baldwin Wallace College in Berea, Ohio. And his photographs of the Isaiah scroll are still the go-to photographs used to this day. They've probably been reprinted in hundreds and hundreds of publications. So, and the Dead Sea Scrolls contain copies of Hebrew Bible manuscripts. Every book of the Hebrew Bible was present there among the Dead Sea Scrolls, with the exception of the book of Esther. Why was Esther left out? Maybe completely accidental. I mean, it was a miracle that these scrolls survived in the desert down by the Dead Sea anyway for 1,900 years. But maybe the fact that the book of Esther doesn't include the word God. Who knows? We don't know. Just idle spec. So,
but remarkably, if we're paying attention to the timeline, when the Revised Standard Version was created, was awfully close to the time that the Dead Seas were found. So if you're sitting in that nice little room at Yale Divinity School and saying, "We've got it, we've got the definitive translation," and then, "Oh, but wait, look at these things we just found in some jars," and you got to go back to the drawing board a little bit.
You're much too optimistic.
Oh,
Because
I am pretty optimistic.
Scholars The Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars were laying their hands on them and fiercely defending their little niche. You know, one scholar would be working on one scroll or one biblical
Well,
book.
right. It takes decades for that to
It
really.
took decades
Yeah.
and decades for that even to be published, even for the original to be published, let alone translations, interpretations, and so on. So the story of the emergence of the Dead Sea Scrolls into the public is really a complicated and vexed and drawn out story. So,
And I tend to think that because it's drawn out, I mean, if we connect to the Episcopal Church, where we think about, we do have these prayer book revisions coming alongside, which are happening because of the same scholarship that led to, you know, in the 50s and 60s, as well as looking at the liturgical movement. We are looking at movements that take decades, if not generations. And so the discovery of Dead Sea Scrolls, if it's going to take them decades just to, you know, get their, you know, the bananagrams together to try to read them and figure out how we're going to read them, it's going to, we're probably still integrating some of those discoveries.
Joseph, I think you had a question. Oh, you didn't? Okay. I saw your hand earlier. I just want to make sure we didn't hear you.
okay, let me go on to why an update, and I think we can deal with this fairly succinctly, and yet this opens up all kinds of considerations. Basically, there are two major encouragements to revision. One, if I may oversimplify, one has to do with new understandings of what the texts meant way back when, and the other is new understandings of how best to talk about those ancient texts here and now in our language. So our understanding of ancient ideas mutates, changes, evolves, and guess what? Our own language is mutating all the time, never ceases. So it's mutation, evolution, change from beginning to end. So let me just read what I say here. New text, the scholars called it text critical revisions. New understandings of the meaning of the ancient texts from which we translate are always emerging. Sometimes previously unknown manuscript copies come to light. For example, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Bottom line, our understanding of the meaning of our ancient text is constantly evolving. It's ever changing. The text itself from antiquity might remain the same, but we develop new insights, new understandings of it. We just see it with different eyes because of any number of influences. So we sometimes are using the very same old text, sometimes brand new discoveries, but regardless, our understandings of the perspective of our ancient ancestors is changing, is mutating.
Well, just think of how much each of us is mutating. Whoa, what's that? Hello. And when we think about the first time that we encountered Scripture, whatever age we were, when I think about how many new lenses I have, or perhaps have taken away some, that's just one short life.
Yeah.
Dorothy had a question.
Yeah, so how would that happen? I mean, you know, you're reading the ancient text and you know what the meaning is, so how does the meaning change in people's heads? Is it because of other writings that happened at the time, or cultural discoveries?
All of the above and more. We will touch on this a bit, maybe quite a bit, next week.
Okay.
In the other significant handout here, I've cherry-picked some changes between New RSV and New NRSVue, and I would propose to look at those next week. And you'll find lots of different new insights there. We're just touching the surface very lightly, going from example to example to example to example. But the reasons may vary widely. I'm tempted to say, love God and sin bravely here. You might want to consider the fascinating example of there are 8 times in the NRSV that male and female temple prostitutes are mentioned. Did you know that there are temple prostitutes mentioned in the Old Testament? The new NRSVue does not abide by that because new scholarship has convinced the players in this translation process that that's all bogus.
Really?
So it's, but there's still,
Excuse me, what's there now?
excuse me?
What's there now?
You're missing your last sentence. You're missing a sentence, a line. Oh, maybe no, there's another page.
What's
Oh, it's on the back.
in what's in the new translation? The understanding is that there is disreputable religious practice going on, but it's not temple prostitution, but it is illegitimate, unsatisfactory, forbidden worship of foreign gods or unorthodox, unacceptable worship of Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So there is shady stuff going on, but for reasons we can get into maybe a little bit next week, I would rather not try to tackle it all tonight. There are good reasons to decide that the temple prostitution thing is dubious. Now, mind you, there is plenty of other just ordinary, everyday street corner prostitution in the Old Testament. You're warmly invited to check it out yourself. If you need some help, let me know.
Visited by important people.
And, and Hosea is a biblical book that starts with him marrying a woman of ill repute, or they marry and she goes haywire or off script. Sex and sexuality is a big part of the Hebrew Bible. Well, shall we? If that tantalizes and you want to read ahead, I think it would be fair to say that if you want to take these handouts home with you, it'd be fine with me, but it would be nice if you bring them back because we probably don't want to print the whole batch all over again. So where did I leave off? We talked a little bit about ancient understandings of ancient texts changing, scholarship coming to new insights, new understandings of things. Sometimes brand new manuscript copies come to light. So lots of ways in which our grasp of antiquity changes. But then at this end, at our place in history, our language changes, and the scholars call this philological revision. Once we have done our best to determine how the ancients likely understood their texts, what would be the best way to express that meaning in appropriate contemporary English? And here I couldn't resist giving a very concrete, specific, important example. For example, if an ancient text said men, but surely intended to mean men and women, the NRSV opts for the latter. Bottom line, our understanding of how best to express the meaning of our ancient text in our own language here and now is constantly evolving. It is ever changing.
Joseph has. I'm
Yeah.
because I'm not sure you're seeing.
Largely a bad job of translation of anthropos, for example, in the New Testament, rather than saying there is definitely a man, but anthropos is human.
Yes, but it's even more problematic than that. we're scheduled, we're projected to have a class on the book of Acts this summer here, and I ain't taken the lead on that, but I am contributing a couple of times, and I've been interested in the book of Acts, knowing that that's coming, but I've been interested in the book of Acts for a long, long time anyway, in part because of the class I did a year ago at this time on the Apostle Paul. It's fascinating to me that there are a number of places in Acts where the author, call him Luke, explicitly, emphatically refers to men and women in Christian communities, Christian groups, men and women. Think the day of Pentecost, like 120 people. And just before the Pentecost thing happens, there's a mention of men and women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus. And then Peter stands up and talks, and he says, Andres Adelphoi, men, brothers. The women are there. The women are there. So those two words, Andres Adelphoi, that's male human beings and brothers, literally. But it was not meant to. Surely women were not being cast aside. And that happens at several places through Acts. So you get this brothers talk. Adelphos is the masculine singular, Adelphoi, masculine plural. But it's a lot like our English word now, brethren. Now we know that is related to the word brother, but in a church setting, if the pastor gets up and says, brethren, we're gathered, you know that everyone is being...
I would not play a Trinity.
And there are certain church circles it would play.
It's certain it would. That's right. Not in any I've ever been in. I will... One question I want to ask in terms of how we experience and read words, that I think one thing that we can say is that now within our culture we have at least a clearer language for power and power differentials, and so that it is not neutral to use the word temple prostitute. That is, we may incorrectly, first of all, start with a gendered approach there, when in fact it was not a specific gender, but there is. It denotes there is a judgment in that word. There is to recognize that may not have been the correct word if we were talking about I wasn't clear if we were talking about in that situation, was it something of a sexual nature or was it just immoral idolatry? But we can save that for another time. Yeah. The question is, in this translation was part of, revision, you're supposed to swap me when I say that. Revision was part of this a recognition that even in language like that, there can be deeper power dynamics at play that we become blind to by not questioning words there that ought not be there. And we can ask the same question of being respectful of Jewish sources. Are we viewing Hebrew Bible narratives through solely our Christian lenses?
Good question.
And through our revision, are we helping to offset that? So that's I don't know if that was more of a monologue than a question, but yes, thank you. Yeah. Is part of it an awareness of how power works through the words that we choose?
Sure. We'll see next week when we go through my cherry-picked examples of linguistic changes. We'll see that there is for sure increased sensitivity to implications. In a number of places, I'll just give one example, then I'm going to get back on where I was. Servant girl. Servant girl is in the NRSV. The revision changes that to female servant because it was thought that calling a female a girl was disparaging.
But was she a girl or was she a woman?
Well, a lot of times we don't know. It's just the noun is female and feminine, rather, and so sometimes it seems
So the Greek does not clarify the age of the.
in
the
some
servant.
cases,
This part.
there are some cases where we're pretty sure it's a young female or a young male, but there are a number of places
Where we
it
might
is.
have seen that neutral in another generation, it may not actually be.
Let me go back to. I hope this whets your appetite for going through some of those changes next week. And if you take this collection of pages home with you and do some homework,
There are 12,000 substantive edits and 20,000 total changes for you all to review between now and next Wednesday.
Well-
So that's on page 3. Sorry, I skipped that.
you don't need to do what I did. I have been studying the Gospel of Mark seriously for 50 years, so I thought I really should do a close read of Mark. And through my handy-dandy Accordance Bible software, it's easy as can be to put the NRSV side by side with the NRSVue, and it marks the changes.
Is there one like that for the Hebrew Bible?
Well, my software handles Hebrew Bible, but I don't know about the comparison options within the Hebrew Bible or between Hebrew Bible and New Testament. So I really don't know. So I worked all the way through Mark. Mark is the only book of the New Testament that I've done this to. And you'd be shocked at how few the changes are. Most of the changes, the little red marks, those are either the addition or subtraction of a comma. Bore me to tears.
There was no punctuation in the original text.
In the original text,
Right.
there is no punctuation. And
The thing that gets me is like, we just read recently where it says Mary and his friend. And that "and" could have been put in there, and it could have been Mary, his friend. We're going to talk about the resurrection.
okay, well, we would have to look at the original on that.
And then Adrian did a sermon recently, where she talked about, I meant to look it up before I came. She talked about it not being the same Bible as the 1600s. That people in the 1600s read something totally different. That was the whole word. I'll have to look it up for next time.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean the King James Version, the original from the 1611 versus the one we use now is mid-18th century?
Ah, yes. The King James Bible itself has mutated. And the version that tended to stick the longest was done in the late 18th century. Yeah, so,
The thing about the King James Bible, though, is that we have such a different understanding now of what it means to be king.
Oh, well, yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so it would have to be changing because people who read it in 1611 were reading it from the point of view of people who, King James and divine right of kings and all that stuff, and people reading it in the 21st century aren't reading it through that lens. So it would have to change
changing, you get a different cultural influence.
Things are constantly mutating, constantly evolving. Let me jump into King James and its legacy. Are we getting enough Q&A so that I'm not hogging all the time? This has been great.
You're doing great.
Let me tell you my little personal story as briefly as possible of how I got interested in this history of the English Bible. I'll just wave this in the air, and you can take a peek at it when we're done if you're so interested. I brought in my copy of the King James Bible facsimile edition. I do not recommend the facsimile edition unless you want to take lots of aspirin to read it.
Or if you get the big volume.
Excuse me?
There's a big volume of it.
But that even that would give me a headache. I will pass around a sample of a. May as well start it around now. This is a sample from the original King James Bible. It's the first page of the translator's preface. And I'll explain that further. This monster is the SBL Study Bible using the new translation. This bloody thing is over 2,000 pages long, and I can't read it because my eyesight is poor. The print is microscopic. I've just had cataract surgery, and I don't have my new glasses. But I'm begging the people who created the wonderful Bible software that I prefer to use to read the Bible. I'm begging them every month or two to put this in their library of resources. They have shelves full of Bible commentaries and study Bibles, rather in the same mode as this, but they just haven't gotten around to doing this yet. So I elbow them every so often. So here is an actual new translation, and Adrian brought down a couple of paperbacks, I think, of it. So, and then the facsimile copy of the King James of 1611. Let me tell you my little story. I went to Yankton College in Yankton, South Dakota in 1978 out of grad school. And it was a tiny, humble little college. Sadly, it was weak because it was so small. And it closed several years after I escaped to come to the paradise of Northeast Ohio, Berea, Baldwin Wallace. So I got out. I abandoned the sinking ship just in time. Actually, it closed 4 years later, so they survived a while. But one day I was prowling the stacks, as I used to do in my youth, and I accidentally discovered this publication done by Edgar Goodspeed. And I recognized the name because I knew he was a University of Chicago person, and I had just spent years there. In fact, there's a Goodspeed Hall named after him. He was a New Testament scholar at Chicago in the early years of the 20th century. And if you look at the chart here at the bottom, there's a Smith Goodspeed Bible. Smith was a Hebrew Bible scholar who actually oversaw a team of translators to translate the Hebrew Bible into modern American English in the 1920s. And Goodspeed apparently did both the New Testament and the Apocrypha solo. And so Smith, Goodspeed, and the 20s and 30s came out with this new translation, and it created a furor. People were angry because, they were messing with God's Word. They were challenging the authorized version. How dare you come up with something that isn't what we've been reading since 1611. So Goodspeed was on the receiving end of a lot of anger and ridicule, and thankfully he was not burned at the stake. Tyndale, 1536. 1536, William Tyndale was burned at the stake. And 1 year before that, his published work, the best representation of his published work was actually published 1 year before he was executed in 1535 by Coverdale. So, and it was all because of King Henry VIII, and you know him about breaking from Rome and the Church of England and blah, 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 blah. So everything is connected to everything else. I found this thing on the shelf of the Yankton College Library, and page 2 of the general handout lists the Goodspeed title. Edgar J. Goodspeed, the Translators to the Reader, Preface to the King James Bible, 1611. I have a scan of his 14-page introduction at home, and if anyone would like a copy of any of the things I indicate here that I have in my possession, I could email it to you, and that would give you hot links to websites and so on. And in some cases, I have PDF copies of stuff that you can't get anywhere else, and I would be glad to email that to anyone. So Edgar J. Goodspeed, the Translators to the Reader. Well, one of the things that poor old Edgar had to deal with is that a lot of people didn't know that the King James Bible was a translation. They thought God had written it. I mean, after all, it's authorized. But what does authorized mean? Authorized means that the King of England says it's a good thing for you to read. And the King James Bible was the third authorized version. The first was the Great Bible, then the second was the Bishop's Bible, and the third and final, as far as we know, is the King James. So authorized,
Which God wrote in English. Right, I think that's the other thing.
Yeah.
In Elizabeth English with red font.
But yeah, this really breaks my brain to try to. This is the first page of the translator's preface, and the whole rest of the King James Bible was produced in this with the same font, and the S's and the F's are virtually identical, which baffles me. V's are written as U's. Lots and lots of spelling is bizarre. The word B-E, for us, is spelled B-E-E. We, W-E, is spelled W-E-E. And it goes on from there, even crazier than that. And there are a bunch of words in here, in either the preface or the King James Bible itself, that are simply no longer in use. They're gone, and therefore they'll be utterly meaningless to someone picking it up today. So,
Bob, one thing that, as you mentioned, Tyndale, it is such a reminder of how high the stakes were, and how important both the dynamic of how the church really controlled access, or so they thought.
Oh yes, power and control.
Power and control. And if you bring in Henry VIII, you're now talking about international intrigue and nations being at war with one another, but also a reminder that those reformers, or those who really sought to have a translation, sought to have something that was accessible to the English people, so that they could read the gospel, so that they could read Scripture, and were willing to put their lives on the line for that.
Yeah.
It is a reminder of what a precious thing this is. And what a gift it is to have the access to it, but also to be able to reflect on how it is changing and how we are changing and how we're being changed by it.
Yeah.
It's a tragedy to think that people would lose their lives because of this, but also a reminder of just how very sacred this is.
No, well said. Well said. I don't think I need to add much more to the Goodspeed story, except to say that this was revelatory to me. I had no clue about the translator's preface, and Goodspeed says very clearly why. They started dropping it out of printings of the King James Bible like early 1800s or so. So for a good while, it's included in printings of the King James Bible, but by the early 1800s, it's regularly being dropped out, I suppose, to save paper and ink, if nothing else. But also, there are a lot of other complaints that were registered against the translator's preface. One was that it was done, it's too academic, and it was very academic for its time in the 1600s. But good grief, you had 54 biblical scholars, mostly scholars from Cambridge and Oxford and Westminster also. But yeah, it was academic. The whole thing is an academic. And so a lot of Goodspeed produced his pamphlet, because a lot of the criticisms that were thrown at him were also thrown at the translators of the King James. But eventually, it got a toehold and became dominant and endured for centuries. So Goodspeed, I think, was identifying with the early translators of the King James Bible. They suffered ridicule, just like he was suffering ridicule in the 20s and 30s. And so his publication is an appeal to the publishing houses, the printing presses that printed the King James Bible, to please put it back in there. I don't think he was much interested in the 3-page tribute dedication. There's a 3-page dedication to the high and mighty Prince James. We don't need that anymore, probably. But he wasn't much interested in that, but he was interested in the translator's preface. And by the way, the King James Bible originally contained the Apocrypha. And by the 1800s, particularly in the United States, Protestants especially were willing to chuck the Apocrypha. And so the Bible translations that I use, like this one, has the Apocrypha in it because lots and lots and lots of Christians use it. And so Goodspeed is really heavily responsible for me being interested in this at all. And since I brought it, I'll wave one other thing in the air. The American Bible Society, God bless them, produced this years ago, and apparently it's still available. It's called The Translators to the Reader, the original preface of the King James Bible. It was put together by a couple of scholars that Debbie and I rubbed elbows with back in the day. And this beautiful thing has the translator's preface in the original facsimile, like this. There's an original facsimile version, and then there's a version in modern typeface, which you can actually read without getting a headache. And then there's a modern paraphrase that they've done to try to take the King's English of 1611 and turn it into modern American English, late 20th century. So this was a wonderful product of the American Bible Society, and I'm afraid it's not typical of what they do anymore, but there it is. It still exists.
Well, as we wind into our last minute, can you give us a preview of next week's class?
Well, I think I would walk you through a little bit more the family legacy. King James, English Revised Version, American Standard Version, RSV, and then new RSV, and then the new one, the UE version. I think I will walk you through that a little bit more because there's some interesting twists and turns in there. We can't do it all exhaustively, of course, but we can hit some highlights. And then mostly in the somewhere buried here is the cherry pick list of changes from the NRSV to the UE.
Excellent.
Have they got the updated edition out now with the Apocrypha?
Oh yeah, it's.
Because the 2 copies over here didn't have it.
Oh, is that a whole Bible? I haven't looked at it. If it's just the New Testament. Oh.
It's the Protestant updated version.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was, Joseph, I was raised in the Presbyterian church. I'd never even heard of it. Until I
Oh, my
went back to
goodness.
school. Till I went back to school and realized that this was something that the Catholics had carried all along, and that having been raised a rather fierce Presbyterian, that was too Catholic for us, so to speak.
Well, now you've helped me out. Now that I'm being married to a Presbyterian minister, I lose every Bible fight ever. But now I can say, yeah, but at least I had the Apocrypha.
Yeah.
Or at least your version of the Apocrypha. I am not a scholar. I'm not a scholar of the Apocrypha. I have dabbled in it a bit.
I can look it up.
I
See
don't
if
know.
I can find something, since he was in Scotland and he's a big one, a big name in the Presbyterian church. So, yeah, that's a good question.
Because what was available would always have the Apocrypha in it. Didn't Coverdale, Tyndale have
Probably in his day, yes. I just to finish my point. I do know enough about the Apocrypha to know that different Christian traditions have different books in them. They might have 14, they might have 16, they might have 18. So it depends on what part of the Christian world you're in.
The Eastern Church has different list of books in the Apocrypha than the Western Church.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Bob, thank you very much for kicking off the dynamic word as we begin to explore the NRSV UE in lowercase letters. And we look forward to continuing next week. Thank you, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you all very much.